Welcome to the Freelance Journalism Podcast. Today's episode is with an icon of freelance journalism, Wudan Yan, who has so many accolades, you'll hear them soon, but she's well known to everyone in the freelance community. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this conversation was talking with her about the ways that we think about ourselves, our identities, as well as our skill sets could be so much broader and more opportunities could be open to us if we just start thinking about ourselves in new ways and talking about ourselves in those new ways. So one note that we recorded this episode before Wudan announced that she's no longer recording new episodes of the Writers Co-op, but rest assured the last 5 years of episodes and all the resources on their website are very useful and remain relevant to everyone. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am so excited for today's guest, Wudan Yan, an award-winning narrative journalist that I'm a huge fan of. She's a fact checker, an entrepreneur based in Seattle. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, MIT Technology Review, the New York Times, and many, many other places. She's a multi-grantee of the Pulitzer Center and also UC Berkeley, the Institute of Journalism and Natural Resources, and the International Women's Media Foundation. But most fangirly of me, I will say, she is the founder and executive producer of the Writers Co-op, one of my favorite podcasts, which is a business podcast and learning academy for freelance creatives. And she's also the founder of Factual, a new fact-checking agency that I'm sure we will discuss in today's podcast. Wudan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, tell us a little bit about your path in journalism and business of journalism and where you started and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So my start in journalism began in 2014 when I rage quit a PhD program about 18 months in. And that was in cancer biology. I was trained as a scientist, and I just was living in New York City and taking the subway for many, many hours every week. And I always had something related to narrative nonfiction tucked in my bag, whether it be an issue of The New Yorker or, a David Quammen book that I had just discovered. And I think I was a voracious reader when I was young. And I think that I was spending so much time reading narrative nonfiction, especially narrative science journalism, gave me an insight into the direction that I wanted to take my career. So when I quit my PhD program, I didn't go to J school. I actually talked to lots of people who made it as a freelancer without a formal education. I was really scared of debt. When I talked to people who went the science writing grad program route or the journalism school graduate school program route, you live in an expensive city or an expensive state and ends up with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And I was not convinced that the journalism industry would be capable of having me be able to pay off that debt quickly.
How prescient.
Yeah. I'm a Chinese immigrant, right? And so I think I have a lot of that immigrant mindset of like, if I don't have to take on unnecessary debt, I'm not going to do that. And so what I did instead was take the advice of some of my early mentors who suggested, if you don't really know what you're doing, which I absolutely did not, apply to be an editorial assistant at magazines that you admire and read and might be able to teach you on the skills of research and fact checking. And that's what I did. I emailed, 50 places in New York City, got so many, was ghosted constantly. Got a few thanks, but we're good responses. But I was really lucky and persistent, and Nautilus magazine actually took me on as an unofficial editorial assistant. There was no post or anything. I was just like, hey, these are my skills. I am very good at doing lab research. I want to apply that and learn editorial and journalistic research. Also, here's some unedited blog posts that I wrote because I really want to write. And so it was great that they took a chance on me. There at Nautilus, I learned how to fact check, which meant I also learned how to report. I see fact checking as reverse engineering reporting. And they also were home to some of my first clips. So from then, my career built and has spanned multiple continents, multiple businesses, and has been a wild journey.
That's so interesting. I actually didn't get as far as you did. I applied to PhD programs. I was an undergraduate in physics and I was rejected from, I should say, I applied to one PhD program at UC Berkeley and was rejected. So I never even started and didn't have to rage quit. But the other echo that resonated with me is when I was covering Wall Street in New York City, I read the New Yorker cover to cover because I had a 45-minute subway
Mhm.
ride. It's the only time in my life that I read the New Yorker cover to cover. So I really appreciate hearing that. And I'm 100% with you that we should not take on more debt because this is such a tough time in the industry. And that's one of the things that I'm really excited to get your insights on because so many freelancers are being created now because of the 8,000 layoffs we've had in the last 3 years in journalism, or graduating from journalism programs and they can't find a full-time job. So when folks like that come to me, I struggle to really say to them, how do you make a living in this business as a freelancer? So what advice would you give? And in particular, would love to hear about different streams of revenue that folks may not have thought of when they were sort of coming up as a journalist or writer even.
I think there's so many challenges of getting laid off from a staff job. And, we kind of have to start with the most existential part, which is when you're a staff person at a publication, handling a very specific beat, your range of focus is quite limited. You have a very specific identity. And I think, there are a few authors out there who have done a much better job explaining this than me, but the belief that like your coworkers are your family, and sometimes people might argue that a newsroom feels like a cult. And
Mhm.
so, leaving or being forced to leave, I think makes people really have to reckon with that identity and their social unit or their quote unquote family unit. And it's very jarring and unmooring. And so I think, before we even start into tactics on how people can diversify, I think a lot of people get stuck because they think of themselves only in a very particular role, which actually is the mindset that prevents them from doing something new or doing something different or utilizing their skill sets to the fullest extent.
Oh, yes. When I first started freelancing after my mass layoff, when I was a national correspondent for Newhouse News Service and then had nothing, the first few press conferences I went to, I didn't know what to put on the badge, but I had one freelance client, so I always put Fortune on the badge. And I would
Mhm.
say, like, I'm Katherine Lewis from Fortune. And it took 3 or 4 years before I realized, wait a minute, they don't own me. Why should I give them credit for having me as part of their team? I'm Katherine Lewis, and that's enough. I don't
Mhm.
need this institutional identity. And in fact, in some ways, it holds you back when you're trying to build a freelance career.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I went through something similar just like socially when I left my PhD program and started my career as a journalist because I didn't feel like I had written enough. I didn't have enough clips. I didn't have enough, names and affiliations for me to really fully identify as a journalist. And so when people, I moved to a new city after I began freelancing, lots of life changes in my early 20s, and people asked me what I did, and I was like, couldn't answer that. It
So
took
maybe
me
it's
a
a
second. Yeah.
yeah, so maybe that's the first thing is, like, find a way to say what you do or who you are that, feels right to you.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe also it sounds like there's an element of who are you in community with in that conversation. So
Mhm.
what would you say as sort of you're thinking broadly as someone who either just graduated from J school and can't find a full-time job or is, recent freelancer with some experience in journalism, how do you think about who you are, what you do, and who you're in community with to begin with?
Yeah, well, those are 2 separate questions, right? Like, how you think about who you are. I think it was, oh gosh, 2 or 3 years ago, I did a piece for Pointer called, "Journalism isn't who you are, it's what you do." If there's a way to conceptualize, like, what the actions are that you take in your day-to-day that generate income, right? Like, that might be different from, um, who you are and what drives you, which is a lot more true to, like, the core of who you are. And the actions that you take, committing acts of journalism, committing acts of, advocacy, committing acts of, like, community service, all of that kind of extends and emanates from your core values and motivators. And so I think that can be a useful way, using language to really tease apart who you are truly, and, like, the things that you do that are in alignment with your true self.
Love it. Yeah. And since we're talking about diversifying income, at the IIJ, we teach this 3 Ps model that I came up with early, in the course of my freelancing, like 15 years ago, that we should have a portfolio of work that some gigs are for pay, some are for passion, some are for your portfolio that you're gonna get other jobs with, or an award or a fellowship or whatever. And ideally you have both motivations or both needs met in a single assignment, but sometimes you don't. And I think there's a parallel way to think about, as all these different ways that you are using your time, right? Whether it's editing or writing or advocacy or serving your community. What are the ways that fits into money that you're going to use to support yourself? How would you advise people to think really broadly about where they might find clients that align with those values, that also are going to meet their, putting bread on the table needs?
Yeah. I mean, I think people typically underestimate how well connected they are, and people typically underestimate how well connected other people can be. I mean, the 6 degrees of connection is real, and I think there are a few layers to this, right? Like, I think people really need to get specific about what it is that they want to do. This is kind of, and I don't know if you feel this way, Catherine, but when people are just like, "Hey, Wudan, I would like some advice on, like, writing features." And I'm like, "Okay, but, like, what advice? What specific questions do you have?" Because when it's so broad like that, like, "Oh, I'm open to freelance work." It's like, okay, like, it's almost like you're trying to relay SEO to, like, a friend or a loved one who could actually really help you, but you're not giving them any specific keywords. It's gonna be harder and harder for other people in your life and community to support you. So I would say the first thing is to get really specific about what it is that you're looking for. Maybe you're looking for, audio producing jobs. Maybe you want to transition to, directing, documentary films. Maybe you want to do content marketing for boutique, biotech ag agencies, so on and so forth. The more specific you can be, the more likely other people can search the Rolodex of their brains and be like, "Oh, I know somebody." Um, so that's the first thing I would say. And second is to start thinking about your your bicycle spoke of relationships. I really struggle to use the word network because it feels really transactional and doesn't always land with people who I'm talking to. So when we think about relationships broadly, the people who are most likely to help you are people who care about you. And those might not always be professional relationships. And so asking your family and friends, um, asking, going on LinkedIn and researching companies that really seem interesting and align with you based on, their PR, and looking for somebody who may know somebody who works at that place and asking for an introduction. I think the more we exist in community, the more natural it is to think expansively about who actually is a relationship. Um, and relationships need to get built over time too. I think that's true of new relationships. Seeing the same editors at conferences, going to local meetups in your city or place of residence. So when to build rapport. So when you have an ask of, "Hey, I'm looking for, this very specific type of work," it's gonna be a lot easier for people to want to do that favor for you. Sometimes I get asks in my inbox from people who I do not know at all who are looking for work, and I was like, how do I help you? Like, I can't vouch for your work. I don't know you. Like, I don't know where to start on this. So I think starting with the people that you know and intentionally building relationships with places that seem, interesting to you at a given moment of your life and career.
Yes, I love that, especially because often I talk to people who say, "Well, I've been putting myself out there." And when you start asking, they're putting it on LinkedIn or Instagram, which is one way of putting it out there, but not investing in relationships and being there. I think it sounds like you're saying in person, or at least, in synchronous communication with someone else, as opposed to blasting, right, through
Yeah.
a social
Yeah.
network.
One thing I've been thinking about is, when people say, "Oh, I'm available for XYZ projects on LinkedIn or Instagram," I start asking, how well does that work? And most of the time people say they get leads from people who are already at who at least have passing familiarity with their work, and very rarely do they get leads completely from cold, new to them, connections. And that's really telling. That's really telling that this like mass spray and pray method of let me put it on social media and pray for the best doesn't really quite have the intended uh, impact that you're hoping for. A much more effective way is going straight into the inboxes of people. I am not I'm not on Twitter anymore, so I feel like I've reclaimed so much of my attention. But attention is at a premium these days, and you know, posting what we've been talking about so far in social media is not a great way to grab somebody's attention. Getting into somebody's inbox of somebody who you already know, who isn't just going to be like, oh, I don't recognize that name, like mark as spam or put it in the trash. That's going to be a much more effective way in getting in touch with somebody and getting potentially something that you want out of that. And so we really have to the concept that I, have named this, or rather have given a name to this, is just direct sales. And for journalists who care about the craft and finding a good story and wanting to make money from their pitched stories and so on and so forth, direct sales doesn't land very well. But when we're trying to think of getting new clients, you have to think in terms of direct sales. Otherwise, you're not going to be successful. And, pitching is a form of direct sales, in fact, because you're like, I have this product, this story product. Would you like it? Right? To a very tailored audience. So yeah, and we need to start thinking that way in terms of expanding our offerings to other clients as well by getting to the people who really need who are either capable of fostering connections or who are in a position and are capable of assigning us work.
And maybe for the framing that might be more palatable for journalists would be source development, right? You don't like blast on social media. Would anyone like to leak me some documents?
Yeah.
You're cultivating and developing relationships. So really good analogy. I want to go back to what you said about being specific.
Mhm.
And this is an area where I often also see new freelancers struggle because they'll come to me and say, "This is my niche." And it's something, very specific. And then I start probing, and it turns out they haven't assessed if there is a market for that kind of work. And they've
Mhm.
like built a website and they've got a rate sheet and they figured out how they're going to manage all this, but they don't actually know if there is workflow there. So
Mhm.
maybe even a step back before you decide, what you're going to be asking for. How do you even assess right now in fall 2024, is there a market for what I think I want to be doing?
How can people how can people figure that out?
Right, like if they
Mhm.
say, "Oh, I want to write boutique copy for nanotechnology firms,"
Mhm.
I find it's much easier to sell into a market, talking about direct sales, sell into a market that's established where they have a point of contact who often hires outside contractors for this kind of work, but that can be hard to assess from the outside.
Yeah, it is. I think this is why it's so important to have a broad community, um, to talk to people, or not, you don't have to be close. You just have to be in like a few groups, right? And be like, hey, I'm really curious about like expanding this arm of my freelance business, are there people in this space, in this group, who would be willing to talk to me for like a chat? I'd be happy to help in return in any way that I can, right? Like kind of having those conversations, informal conversations, to really assess the state of the market. Unfortunately, freelance writers are not a group that is organized enough or has the capacity to take on the emotional work of putting together reports that assess different states of the freelance market. And so I think it really depends on just talking to people. Like I had a question the other week about pricing, fact checking for documentary projects. I was like, oh, I know a few groups where I can ask people, groups where I have given advice, and now I am in there asking for advice, probing the hive mind. And so, I think creating and entering and finding psychologically safe spaces to ask those kinds of questions is really important. So I would say that's a key element, because nobody, like you and I, who have been in this industry for, a collective, who knows, like multiple decades, don't even have that insight, right? Like people can only figure it out if they do their own research.
Yeah, or if you're in it every day, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So really, and to extend the analogy, that's sort of the reporting piece where we can use our reporting skills to really understand, like, what is the state of this market right now? Are there folks hiring? Are they paying enough, for me to live on? So I'd love to also, in the sort of spirit of brainstorming, for someone who maybe thinks of them about themselves narrowly as like someone who writes, feature stories for digital media. And we want to think about what are all the skills that you have that you might think about deploying elsewhere. Wudan, would you help that a hypothetical person brainstorm, like, what are the other things that they maybe don't notice that they're good at, that they might enjoy using in fields that could supplement their journalism work?
Yeah. So if you're doing narrative features, you know what makes a really good character, right? I'm just gonna, brainstorm
Yes,
skills,
love
like
it.
very discrete skills that go into writing narrative features. Okay, you know what's a good story, and usually characters need to drive that story development. So you also know what makes a really good character. You know how to interview for character and story. So I would say anything that requires writing a profile. um, you know, I feel like narrative journalists poo-poo the single source profile kind of stuff, but honestly, that's a big chunk of my income. And
It's a good gig.
yeah, I mean, not in journalism, but outside of journalism, and it is so much fun and so easy, and, like, your hourly rate works out great, there's hardly any scope creep, and that is a great skill to bring into so many different client bases and needs. You can bring it to content marketing, agencies or firms, companies that require content marketing. You can bring that to institutional clients who just want you to spotlight a researcher or a staff member. So that really comes in play in many different ways. The second skill that goes into a feature is research. Um, you probably have had to dig really deep into one topic. And so whatever skills that you have, and this differs for every story. If it's an investigative, you probably know how to use Pacer. If it's investigative, you probably know how to use Lexis. You probably know your way through white pages. You probably aren't afraid to like make unsolicited phone calls, be like kind of man on the street. There's so many ways to kind of break down that skill set of research even. So if you're a man on the street, if you're really good at looking through public records, you can do like investigations. Not at the level of like CIA work, but this season on the Writers Co-op, I interviewed Maya Lau, who was a former journalist, and now she runs a financial investigations company and also hosts Other People's Pockets. And so she kind of took that skill of like being really good at doing research on financial documents and people and interviewing people, that she built it out into a business. So if people are listening and are interested in that episode, I would go check it out. So that's a great example of taking like one specific skill and running with it. And research can also dovetail into fact checking, for instance, which we'll probably talk about later on, so I won't elaborate on here. And the third skill is that if features require on the ground reporting, you have also familiarize yourself with the process of managing logistics to get yourself to a place,
Mhm.
to arrange all your own interviews. In podcasting and documentary film, that's called field producing. And
Mhm.
so, those are some ways to really distill the mechanics, the like nitty gritty mechanics of what goes into a feature story and blow it up into a completely different service area with a different set of clients. But I think, one fun exercise is to just like look at the last 2 or 3 features that you wrote and just like write down on a sheet of paper. And the sheet of paper is important because I feel like there's something happens in your brain when you are so like analog about this,
Mhm.
of every single skill that went into reporting at, like those 3 stories, and kind of see like, oh, what are really interesting? What are parts of the um, production of a narrative feature that I actually really enjoy, and, kind of like earmark your top 3 or 5 and then explore if there's a market for those, right? Talk to other people in your community and then go from there.
Love it. Yes, and cold calling is one of those things that we just do as journalists, and other people are terrified of it.
Mhm.
So, one of those things that we take for granted, similar to that episode with Maya Lau, I ran across a colleague who left journalism and was doing due diligence for Wall Street firms, hedge funds or
Yep.
other investment firms that need to do diligence to do due diligence before a transaction. So a lot of things that we take for granted as part of our day, when you tease them out like that on a piece of paper, I love the analog suggestion. It's super valuable. So, in particular, I would like to talk about fact checking because I was so interested to see you launch Factual. I don't know that space at all, but from my experience as a freelancer, it seems to me that fact checking is less and less common in the workflow from the publications I write for. So I'm curious about, what you're seeing in that space and how folks would present themselves as a fact checker if that's something that they want to add to their sort of suite of services or their portfolio of work.
So let me just clarify something. You're saying you're seeing fact checking because become less common with print publications?
Yeah, I do
Okay,
a lot
yeah.
of my own fact checking, right?
Okay,
Because
well, mhm.
they're not doing it.
Yeah, well, we can't really call what you do as fact checking, but we can get into that or
Got
not.
it.
Double checking is my preferred term for that.
Got it.
So, I fact check for print, or sorry, digital publications, print and digital publications. I fact check narrative narrative podcasts, limited series narrative podcasts. I fact check documentaries. I've also been approached to fact check books. I fact check quite a number of books. I am asked to fact check white papers. I am, it kind of goes down the list. And part of it, I realized when clients get on a call with me, or when I get on a call with that client, is that they find me because I have really good SEO.
Nice.
I mean, this happens when you have a business website for over 10 years. And, I'm constantly linking back to that when people are building author pages and so on and so forth. So the reputation of my page has really increased. And so I see a lot of inbound requests. I mean, the reason I started Factual was because I had too many inbound requests, too many for me to take on myself. And sometimes clients don't have the budget to hire me specifically, but they might have the budget to hire somebody else. And that's when Factual comes in, kind of like serving as a beacon for nonfiction producers and matching them with a vetted pool of freelance fact checkers. But I do think the market is shifting. I think old school, what you and I may consider old school journalism, may be diminishing because print publications and digital publications are diminishing. People are getting laid off. There's less capacity for fact checking, and something has got to go. Unfortunately, somehow the veracity of facts is one of the first things that's to go.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I think the landscape is changing a lot. In the last decade, there have been a few instances of very embarrassing cases that, podcast producers did not fact check a award-winning show. The most notable is probably Caliphate that came out of the New York
Right.
Times. The main character's story just didn't hold up after the show won a Murrow Award, I believe.
Mhm.
And so just like really embarrassing. There are a few examples in the documentary world as well. in books for sure, memoir especially. And so, uh, yeah, I think back to thinking broadly, fact checking can be a skill that, is seen as an old school magazine standard, but then it has so many wide applications to like the range of things out there in the world that need to get fact checked.
Hmm. And where do people now would they sort of demonstrate that they can do that? As you say, I've never fact checked someone else's work. I've double checked my own. What would you want to see, before you said, okay, yeah, this is someone that I consider a fact checker or who can do this?
Yeah, so Factual's application is really interesting. If people apply for an editing job or a reporter job, they probably have to do like a crappy unpaid editing
Hmm.
assignment or an unpaid writing assignment. I'm not putting my applicants through any of that because I actually want to increase the pool of freelancers in Factual's fact checking database. And so when I'm in the weeds of fact checking, especially when trying to like source a fact that relies on news stories, the more or less rule of thumb is to find two news stories from two independent news sources that more or less say the same thing. And so, what I'm asking for are for fact checkers to list work samples that have references, um, who Factual would basically contact with a set list of questions to assess the quality of that fact checker's work on a recent assignment in the
Hmm.
past year.
Yeah.
And so this requires no time input of the applicant beyond filling out the application, but it's on the agency to do that independent verification of the applicant in the exact same way that any fact checker would independently verify facts. And so we rate applicants on a scale, and people who score highest or above a certain limit are accepted into our system. And this is not a job that AI can take over. Unfortunately, my human brain has to be in the emails, being like, okay, so there are a lot of words. The references use a lot of words to describe, how this fact checker worked, and that's great. And I love this information. It helps me make a better decision. So yeah, that's how. Unfortunately, this is one of those things where, for Factual, in order to get more experience, you need experience.
Right.
And so back to what we were talking before about distilling the all the things that go into reporting and how that can be brought into different industry areas or service areas.
Right. And I also am curious, we've talked about a lot about the skills, but I also want to talk about the clients, like who are, maybe help us think broadly about, who are the potential clients for our communication skills for all these different kinds of services potentially. We talked about maybe a law firm or a financial firm that's doing investigations. What other types of clients would you suggest that people, when they do that, look at their relationships, look at their networks, who are the people they know? What are some of the industries or job titles you know, that should make them think, oh, that could be someone who has a lead for me, but maybe doesn't even know it.
Hmm.
Like, for example, I always tell people I did a lot of writing case studies and editing, and ghostwriting for nonprofits. So I often say, well, if you have folks who work for nonprofits and there's someone who's a director of communications, they often have more writing and editing than they can do. And sometimes that's a good source of a contract job.
Yeah, nonprofits can be good. I mean, even looking at universities, um, some schools are so large that they have a business school, an engineering school, a medical school, and all of those schools have different magazines. Question
Yes.
mark, different content needs. Like, I'm just like, pick a university, pick the closest university to you, pick your alma mater. Like, I don't really care. Like, just
Right.
go through this exercise of listing all the departments, kind of, finding the Venn diagram of your interests and the departments, and see, like, go online, do some research, and see what departments have, that director of communications and so on and so forth. Like Google Quarterly Magazine, like Department of Engineering, Brown University. I'm just saying Brown because I went there. Like they're just do research.
Yep. Yep.
um, do research. That's what it comes down to. And so I think, yeah, people can just pick anything. What so some for a while I was working with maybe a coaching client who's more lifestyle. And I'm like, oh, lifestyle, and you want to pick up new clients? Like, look at the products that you have around your house. Like, I'm just going to start picking up random stuff that I use every single day, and see if they like have content, right? Like,
Hmm.
a few years ago, I was creating content for Patagonia, and I went through a phase of like, oh, maybe I want to do more work for other outdoor companies. And I go into my gear closet and I'm just picking names off a plate and then entering them and seeing like, oh, what does their digital presence look like? Like, where are they investing in content? Who might be a good fit, right? Like, what are the brands that I just think are doing a really good job with ethics and customer service and stuff? So, yeah, I think if you're kind of just like looking for inspiration, I would just say like rummage around your house.
I love it. Well, they say, live your life as a story, right? Look for
Yeah.
leads and story ideas. And I do think that it's helpful to start with what you know. I think one of the reasons that I've been successful as a freelancer is having that physics degree, and then so I can write a lot of science stories, and then having a business journalism background. And there's just so many areas where those two niches are helpful. My last question for you will be also to think about when you're saying, this is what I want to do. I often think of myself as having several niches as opposed to just one. And that gives me a little bit more flexibility to see an opportunity in the market and move in that direction. And also it keeps me less boxed in. And I'm curious if you agree, that it's good to have a couple different things that you do, or if, you think, especially as a starting out freelancer, you may not know where the opportunities are. Is it helpful to have 3 or 4 different specific things you're looking for leads on, or is it better just to ask for one type of niche?
I mean, this almost goes back to the identity point. Like, it's okay to have multiple identities. Like, all of those identities can serve you in a very specific way. And in fact, like, you're calling them niches, I'm calling them identities. But when I go and look for content marketing clients, the language that I use is so much more different than if I'm trying to find a copy editing client, if I'm trying to land an institutional client. Um, Right? And so I think I need to, but in order for the person on the other side to be like, wow, Wudan really sounds like she knows what she's doing, she's confident in what she does, like, I need to feel that myself. And this might
Mm,
feel a little like woo, but we can't convince other people to hire us if we can't convince ourselves in the first place that we deserve to be hired for a very specific thing. And so people who box themselves in, like, sure, maybe you work in a niche that is like very profitable, there's no shortage of work and so on and so forth. But I think when people have a hard time code switching in a way between different services, then I think it becomes very, I mean, there are challenges too in just identifying as a fact checker or a content marketing writer. Um, because people are really bad at grasping multitudes, that people
yes.
contain multitudes. I
Yes.
can't, can go on forever of all the people who just think of me as a fact checker, but not a reporter or an editor. And it's super frustrating because in their mind, they're closing me off to doing other services for them.
Mm.
Um, but it also matters how we talk about ourselves first and foremost. And so I think the developing of separate identities almost for all the different things that we want to do needs to come first.
I love it. Yes, 100%. I think it's hard sometimes when you're starting off to get in that positive frame of mind, but I would never start a conversation with someone I was hoping to win business from without being in that able, or at least able to fake it a little bit of that like confidence and, you know, and and I agree with you 100%. I don't think it sounds woo. I think it's something that we need to do for ourselves or for our colleagues who are also freelancers. So that's another, it brings us back to community. And I think having, when you don't have that confidence, having a friend or a group of friends that can help you get it back for the interaction you need is super, super helpful as well. This has been such a great conversation, Wudan. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you had hoped to mention or you think is important for folks to know around, diversifying and trying to get a solid base of clients and revenue?
Yeah, the other thing I want to say is interesting thing about freelancing, and it's now I identify a lot more as an entrepreneur than I did even 2 years ago when I was still running and owning 2 businesses. But I think freelancing, a lot of journalists get into freelancing because they want the creative expression of what their work can be. And I think the more that freelancers are forced to diversify in this current, very uncertain, very free-falling media environment, um, I do wonder if it'll help everyone build their muscles in developing a business. And kind of back to what we were doing with that feature story and distilling it into separate skills, running a freelance business is running a small business is a very specific skill set. And I think it's one to pay attention to. And when people come into my coaching room, they're like, "Oh, I don't know what I would do if not journalism." I There's so much to peel back there, but what I want people to really see is that by freelancing, by building a business, by learning from the mistakes in your business, like, you are also developing the skills to build literally any other business, whether it be media adjacent, whether it be outside of media, and so on and so forth. And so I don't think that's a skill worth discounting. A lot of entrepreneurs kind of also, like, started out in the early phases of, like, fake it till you make it, right?
Yes.
And so I see for me personally, freelancing has become the gateway drug to entrepreneurship. And, like, I don't know, is entrepreneurship and media going to be a gateway for me to do something else later on? Like, possibly, like, I'm open to it. But I also think that now I've created my third business. I've learned a lot in building businesses of all different sizes, of all different revenue models, and so on and so forth. And so, kind of that's been really fun for me. I really love that. And I know that's not everyone, but I think it is something interesting to pay attention to, because if you're really good at sales in your freelance business, like, I don't know, you can do biz dev for, like, a startup, right?
Mhm.
Like, again, there's so many different skills that you can take into different industries. And, like, I wish people kind of worked on the identity component, because it could lead to leaving, um, undesirable work arrangements, whether freelance or staff or contractor or whatever, but it really gives people a lot more freedom. And I think, generally speaking, people want more of that.
Well, I love to end on a positive note, and what I will also add is, it is a tough time right now, and I started my entrepreneurship journey in November 2008, which literally was the worst month of the Great Recession.
Mhm.
So, it's a tough time, and it's such a great opportunity, and I love what you said, Wudan, that investing in your skill as an entrepreneur is something, even if this approach or this niche or these niches don't work out for you, or these identities as a, freelancer don't work out, you're building your skill set in a whole different area that probably will serve you well, no matter what. So I really appreciate that parting note. And thank you so much for your time, Wudan. Always such a pleasure to learn from you and be in community with you. And Wudan Yan will put all of your many identities and businesses in the show notes, and hope to stay in touch. Thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Catherine.
The Freelance Journalism Podcast is a production of the Institute for Independent Journalists. Our mission is the emotional and financial sustainability of freelancers of color. Learn more about our work at theiij.com and use the code POD10 for a discount on our annual conference and other events open for registration now. That's POD number 10. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or both. You can find our free webinars and other offerings on YouTube, and your recommendation and sharing with friends is the greatest compliment and helps us discover new listeners. Thanks for listening.